Today, we're going to turn this rendering into this bookcase. Welcome. Today we're going to go through building a custom bookcase. This is my first bookcase I've ever built, but it was really simple. I'm going to use the Festool Domino for my joinery today, but if you don't have one, I'll also talk about ways you can get around that. Anyway, in particular, I like using multiple wood species in my builds, and this is no different. I used the walnut plywood and both birch solid and birch plywood in various places. You might also notice that I changed my plans during the build. These things happen, so don't shy away from it. Just make sure that you don't rush into cutting things before you're working them out and making sure that you take stock of what you currently have. You don't want to make cuts and find out the size wasn't right. That's the worst thing ever. So anyway, let's get started. This full sheet of walnut ply was cut down into strips to make it easier to transport. But from here, you want to decide what you'll be doing with each piece. Make sure that mark them on the ply so you don't get mixed up later. When you're doing the real cross cut, make sure you have something like a plywood backer through the cut. Without it, you'll likely get a blowout looking like this. Something as simple as this strip will help make sure that you get a clean cut. Whew! So nice. Dry fitting anything you're building, if possible, is so helpful. In this example, I thought I cut everything correctly, but turns out it was around 3/4 of an inch too tall. I have a small shop, so I put everything on 2 speed horses to keep it out of the way. This next part might offend some woodworkers, but the setup works really well for me. When I'm jointing long or difficult boards, specifically when I'm jointing the edge, I use this. The one past the blade has to be the featherboard, since the board can pull away from the fence of the jointer, and the featherboard still catches the board to get it back to the fence. When dealing with edge banding, it's best to leave it a bit thicker than needed and flush trim it later. I made a mistake of making it just under the thickness of the plywood. Either way, you'll want to lay it out to make sure it looks good. I did leave the banding long so I could cut it after the glue up with my flush cut saw. Had I did this again, I'd glue the banding first before cutting the boards so as to not add steps to the process. The next step is to route out the recess for the backer. I wanted to hide the plywood, and doing this would make it so that you couldn't actually see the ply from the sides and top. However, sometimes if you don't set it up right, the cutter can ride up without you noticing, which in this case blew out through the top. Once I collected myself, I went to work repairing it. Here's how I did it. First, when fixing a mistake, you have to cut more material away in order to make it a flat edge. I did that by scoring the cut line first and then chiseling out the excess. Once that was done, I took a piece of plywood and glued it in place. If I had solid wood, I'd be able to sand it to perfection, but because of the thin veneer on plywood, I couldn't sand much of it. Either way, I think my first repair went pretty well. Anyway, it's important to set up the parts in the correct orientation and in the right spot so the joinery will match up, because you likely won't get another crack at it. So, I took the bottom supports and placed them on the underside of the top piece. While I'm no master at using this tool, confirming the orientation of the tool is incredibly important. But if you don't have a domino, I'd suggest using a router with a straight edge or a track to cut the mortises. In this section, I used the toe kicks as the support. One of the things I had to make sure was I wrapped my head around was the orientation of the domino itself. The bottom of the tool has to be in the same spot for both cuts, otherwise it will likely be slightly off. The floating tenons for the domino are expensive, but making your own doesn't take very long. I took some scrap stock walnut and batched out a ton of them. The only thing that might be a time suck is to do the roundovers to fit. I didn't have an 1/8 inch roundover bit for my router, so instead I used a quarter plane for woodpeckers. That thing worked a charm. After I made them all rounded, I brought each stick over to the table saw and cross-cut them to length that I needed. I still have a ton of sticks left, even after getting all the floating tenons that I needed. Every time I do a glue up, I try to make sure that I have everything ready to go in the orientation that it needs so I don't have to scramble during. One of the last steps was to get the adjustable shelves drilled. Using the piece of scrap plywood, I marked a 1 3/4 inch line from the edge. That would be directed to the outside of the case. From there, I made a gap of 2.5 inches between each hole. Finally, to finish the jig, I cut a piece of plywood that made a small lip on either side and attached that to the outside of the piece. That allowed it to be reversible. When drilling the holes, it's incredibly important that you use a collar on the drill bit. Without that collar, you're likely to blow right through the outside of the case. Once I drill the holes, I used the pins that I was going to use for the shelves to hold the jig at the right height as I moved up. You don't need some fancy ones from the store. The last part is to make sure the shelves can't come out. I used my spiral upcut bit to make a little notch that would help seat the shelves in place. Since the pins are 1 3/4 inches away from the outside, this was so simple to do. Now when I put the shelves in place, they fit perfectly and the pins themselves don't tip, like they did without the recesses. Anyway, here's the final bookcase in its final home. My daughter put all her books in place as well as her toys in there, so it seems like she really likes how accessible everything is, and we definitely like how everything has a home. I hope you enjoyed watching me build this bookcase. Let me know what you think, if you have any questions, or what you'd like to see on the next build. Until next time, I hope you get out there and make something wonderful.
Like and subscribe.